what you reflect on as surgeons when you do a fairly routine AVR and grafts, what you consider to be routine in that first post-operative night. Your patient becomes acidotic. Over the next 2 days, it's clear that they've developed acute kidney injury score 2 or 3. Then they have a horrid time in HDU with delirium, and eventually they leave hospital. You have no idea what impact that has on their recovery. You might want to blame the anaesthetist and the intensivist, but I wonder whether you consider whether your perfusion, how much your perfusion has contributed to the outcome of your patient, and importantly, whether your perfusion could have been better. Or do you simply go on bypass and push the autopilot button and hope that everything is as good as it can be? Well, 15 years ago, that might have been a reasonable thing to do, because the evidence behind what constituted optimal perfusion was really quite lacking. But in the last decade, there have been some very large scientific advances on what constitutes optimal perfusion, and especially with regard to perfusion pressure, pump flow, hematocrit, and temperature. And you're going to hear a lot more from Professor Ranucci in a short time on some of these things. There is no doubt that perfusion gives a state that is dysoxic and induces an inflammatory state, as indicated here. And these, in turn, result in acute kidney injury, delirium, coagulation, and other disorders. So what is the ideal marker? Well, the ideal marker is sensitive in that it is 0 at baseline and that increases rapidly with the injurious state that precedes. It's inexpensive. We can do it in the operating room. Ideally, as the injurious state increases, so does the marker, but also if we make an intervention to improve what's going on, we will see the marker decrease in concentration or whatever it is that you are measuring. If we rely on a marker that you measure on admission to intensive care, we want that to be early enough and be specific enough to allow us to employ a reasonable therapeutic intervention. And perhaps the ideal thing we could have is a predictive marker of how our patients are going to tolerate CPB. So let's look at a marker that we look at every day in our patients in intensive care, and you come and have a look at this. We know that the kidneys are damaged almost from the get-go when you go on bypass, and yet it's only on day 1 or 2 that we rely on the plasma creatinine concentration to indicate how bad the acute kidney injury, and this is way beyond the point where any reasonable therapeutic interventions is going to reverse the injury that has occurred. Other markers that we look at and we repeat regularly in the operating room are plasma lactate, and what we're using the lactate for is to try to find out if some organs, all organs, are switching from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism and generating lactate, and an indication when the DO2, the oxygen delivery, has fallen such that the oxygen consumption becomes dependent on the oxygen delivery, and the lactate increases at that point. But the problem is the lactate only starts to appear in the blood in reasonable concentrations towards the end of bypass, and again probably later than the time we can usefully employ a different strategy. But we know from papers in the past that the peak lactate that is achieved, especially above 4, is significantly associated with morbidity, and above 6 with mortality. And Professor Ranucci has shown that the peak lactate concentration during bypass is strongly associated with the lowest oxygen delivery during bypass. So why not just simply measure oxygen delivery? Well, it's not difficult to do because it's constituted from the pump flow and from the hemoglobin, and I'm not going to talk any more about hemoglobin, but simply to say that the suggestion is that we have a figure of about 280 mils per minute per meter squared. So again, we could perhaps measure a continuous measure of oxygen delivery and make a reasonable therapeutic intervention. And industry have responded. They have now provided perfusion with high fidelity gas electrodes and monitors that will allow us to see the oxygen delivery. So if we take that figure in our head and we run with it, and we think that if everyone is above that, will everything be okay? Well, of course, there will always be exceptions. This chap thought that the average depth of the water across the river was 3 feet, and he wasn't going to drown. Well, there are lactate electrodes, but these aren't available to us in perfusion, as far as I'm aware. Instead, you can look at other markers of whether the patient is generating lactate, because the lactic acid dissociates with it from its proton. The proton then combines with bicarbonate, and we can measure the CO2 that's produced. So there's an idea of some global markers that we might be paying a bit more attention to during bypass. But how are we going to use these clinically? Well, Antonino Rubino and his group have suggested this score called the QALY-P score. They combined the markers that I've just outlined together with 6 other markers of optimal perfusion. This is a retrospective analysis, but what they showed was if the score is simply 1, it's significantly associated with postoperative acidosis. A score of even 2 is associated with acute kidney injury 2, and if your score is greater than 5, it's associated with acute kidney injury 3, which may require dialysis, and with more mortality. Mike Poulis has taken the same approach, but this hasn't progressed since 2012. I don't know him, and I'd love to discuss this with him. I think it's a really interesting concept. So that on your perfusion record, you can actually record the median and the lowest blood pressure, that is there, but also a value and a calculation of cumulative oxygen debt or maximum oxygen debt during the bypass run. This may be important for the individual patient in looking back, but what it's really pointing to is that in a case series which compares one intervention against another, these are really interesting measures to have recorded rather than just the intention that the flow is 2.2 litres per minute per metre squared and that the perfusion pressure is aiming for a MAP of 65 or whatever it is. So that's global markers as they exist, and there of course are others. What about organ-specific biomarkers? What are often termed in the papers as novel? That's the problem. They're fairly novel, and unfortunately the majority of them have very wide inter-individual variability. So it's very hard to compare an individual patient with another. Where they are useful is comparing groups of patients with one intervention against another. NGAL and cystatin C, we're probably more familiar with those names. You've seen them coming up in the papers. And this group, Mike Haas because I don't know where he's from, have suggested that if we measure NGAL, which is a marker of tubular injury, on admission to the intensive care unit, it is strongly predictive of the patients that will develop acute kidney injury, and perhaps it's early enough for a therapeutic intervention. Not only whether they will develop AKI, but also the duration and the severity of the AKI. Cystatin C is not as convincing, but they say this is statistically significant. This is a much quicker marker of glomerular filtration compared to what we currently use, which is creatinine. So finally, I'll discuss with you a marker that we might think about using to predict how well our patients are going. And again, I concentrate on the kidney. Brain natriuretic peptide, although detected originally in pigs, is actually a marker released from the ventricles and is a marker of the filling status and of congestive cardiac failure. This group from McMaster University have measured it on admission to the preemptively before surgery, and in patients who had an elevated level of pro-BNP were more likely to develop acute kidney injury, and if their values were in the range of congestive heart failure above 3,000, and especially if they were above 1,000, the odds ratio of getting AKIN 2 or 3 were both above 4. So is this useful to know? Of course, in pre-planning, deciding one where you're going to change your circuit. But where I think this actually is pertinent to today's discussion about trials of one bypass circuit versus another, if you have a marker, if this is validated, that shows a population that is 4 times more likely to develop acute kidney injury, your sample size for an interventional study in perfusion will be achievable rather than a pipe dream. So finally, just to say, this small print is there to remind you that when you next do an aortic valve and grafts, as it says in the adverts, your investment may go up as well as down. Thank you.